Tribes is one of the most influential game franchises of all time. It introduced countless innovations that changed the first-person shooter genre forever, and opened the door for games like Halo and Battlefield. Yet, despite its legacy, Tribes has never truly reached mainstream success. Some in the community claim that this is because Tribes is simply too difficult for the average gamer. There's a kernel of truth in that statement, but the full truth is far more complex than that. Each Tribes game has, for the most part, been celebrated by critics for its unique jetpack-fueled gameplay. But the franchise's history has sadly been marred by more failures than successes, due to a pattern of botched launches, corporate mismanagement, and broken promises. So what made Tribes so revolutionary for its time? Why did such a beloved series fail to grow beyond a niche following? And what does the future hold for Tribes and the FPS-Z genre that it spawned? Today, we'll dive into the history of Tribes, analyzing how each entry in the series innovated on the FPS formula, but ultimately fell short of reaching mainstream success. And we'll explore why, despite all of its struggles, Tribes will forever be known as one of the most important multiplayer games ever. Let's begin with where it all started in Tribes 1. Developed by Dynamics and released in December 1998, Starsiege Tribes broke new ground for the FPS genre. Up until that point, first-person shooters had largely been defined by titles like Doom and Quake, games that confined players to dark, narrow hallways, small team sizes, and relatively simple game modes. In contrast, Tribes seamlessly blended indoor and outdoor environments with sweeping vistas and endless terrains stretching into the horizon. It featured massive battles with up to 16 players per team, clashing over multifaceted objectives. Modes like Capture the Flag demanded intense levels of coordination with layers upon layers of gameplay mechanics and systems that made Tribes the most complex and strategic shooter yet. For instance, Tribes introduced a class system where players could choose between light, medium, and heavy armor, as well as equipable backpacks and weapons, each offering unique advantages and abilities. Base assets were another critical aspect to a Tribes game. Destroy the enemy's sensors and you'd blind them. Shut down their inventory stations and they'd be unable to buy the gear that they need. Disable their generator and pull the plug on their entire operation. Players could choose from an arsenal of 10 weapons to suit their position and playstyle, including the now iconic disc launcher. Most weapons in Tribes featured relatively slow projectile speeds as well. This design choice is particularly notable because it meant that aiming wasn't a simple point-and-click affair. Players had to lead their targets, who were often sailing through the air with the use of their jetpack, and predict where they would be in the future to land the shot. Tribes was also the first FPS ever to include both infantry and vehicle gameplay. Depending on the map, basic flying vehicles could be purchased from your team's vehicle station. Choose from a scout, a one-man mobile flyer with a rocket launcher, or larger armored personnel carriers to ferry heavy armors from across base to base. A team captain could open a command screen to track the action and even assign waypoints and objectives to individual players, turning matches into tactical skirmishes. One aspect that makes Tribes stand out from any shooter I've played since is the unique positions that make up a proper team composition. A Tribes match more closely resembles football than Call of Duty, with players in dedicated offense and defense roles. Players could define their own playstyle as well by mixing and matching armor types, weapons, and packs. For instance, a turret farmer might spend the entire match on base upkeep and defense, repairing down generators and deploying remote turrets and inventory stations to support their team. A heavy on flag barely moves from the flag stand, using his large body to block enemy flag runners and deploying mines on the flag stand. And the flag capper, the most unique role to Tribes, whose entire purpose is to build breakneck speeds in order to grab the enemy flag and bring it home in record time. Then there was the VGS, a quick voice communication system so good, it may still be my favorite today.
Wait for my signal to attack! Attack! Get the enemy flag! Return our flag to our base! Cover me! We need more defense!
Players could choose from one of 10 different voice packs, and with just 3 key taps could relay just about anything, from return our flag, repair our generator, or more often than not, taunting the enemy team with come get some, or the iconic Shazbot. No mic needed. It was simple, it was fast, it was intuitive. It's the kind of system many modern games still get wrong today, Oh, and Fortnite dances? Yeah, you know what I'm gonna say.
All
Tribes
right.
had those too, all the way back in
Yeah.
1998.
Yeah. Retreat! How'd that feel?
This may sound like a gushing love letter, and that's because it is. Tribes is my favorite game of all time after all. It's hard to overstate though, just how revolutionary this stuff was. But this was simply Tribes as it was meant to be played. The community would soon discover a bug that would completely change the game. Skiing was discovered by an early beta tester who found that repeatedly spamming on the jump key just as they touched the ground made them glide across the terrain without any friction at all. This meant that players could use their jetpack to sail high into the air, gain speed from gravity as they fell to the ground, and convert that potential energy into velocity as they skied across the natural slopes of the environment. Skilled players could utilize the terrain on each map like half-pipes in a planet-sized skate park to build up insane momentum, turning firefights into high-speed chases across mountains and valleys. Thankfully, developers at Dynamics turned a blind eye to this exploit that would eventually become core to the franchise. Skiing also introduced a new role to Tribes, the flag capper. Capper's job was to develop and master intricate routes that took advantage of each map's unique terrain in order to grab the flag at the highest speed possible, evading enemy defense and returning home as quickly as possible. The way Tribes was originally developed, it might take 30 seconds or even longer to return with the enemy flag. But a talented capper on a good route could do this in 10 seconds or less. The size and complexity of Tribes maps meant that there was effectively an infinite number of routes to discover with no upper limit at all on how fast you could move. This led to a vibrant culture of players discovering, sharing via demo recordings, and refining the best possible routes for each of Tribes' many maps. On top of this, Tribes' relatively slow-moving projectile weapons and players' newfound speed now demanded that players have on-the-fly calculations of your relative velocity to your opponents in order to land a shot. The community fully embraced this insane skill ceiling, celebrating its unique gameplay through montages. These early precursors to the modern frag video showcased the most jaw-dropping maneuvers, coordinated team plays, and of course, impossibly long-range midair disc shots. These videos became a cornerstone of the Tribes culture, highlighting the creativity and precision that defined the game. I still come back to these videos when I need to experience that inevitable rush of nostalgia it will give me. While Tribes didn't have the visibility or impact of StarCraft, or even other arena shooters like Quake, it cultivated a passionate competitive community, and in fact, can rightly be credited as one of the founding fathers of modern esports. At its peak, hundreds of teams competed across some of the very first online gaming ladders like Online Gaming League or OGL, and Team Warfare League or TWL. Especially given Tribes' larger team sizes of 10 players per team, this meant that thousands of players were engaged in organized play, fueled by passion for the game rather than prize money. Fierce rivalries emerged as top teams like 5150 and Southside Stoners clashed for spots at the top of the competitive ladder, spawning the kind of forum trash talk that went on to define the game's culture. These players were not motivated by earnings, but by the thrill of competition and recognition within the community. The Tribes community also played a key role in the birth of modern esports commentary, with the first professional shoutcasts emerging from an organization called the Tribes Shoutcast Network, or TSN, which later became known as the Team Sportscast Network.
Returned it yet. Grabbed by Special out of the field. He's got 20 seconds to go. Escape some more. 20 seconds. The IE flag is at home. He's got a good chance to get this. He's got a lead on his chasers. 13 seconds in front of his base. Looking for Special to come in and cap it. He caps it. Special for IE ties it up 2-1, and the map is over.
Many notable esports commentators, some who you might recognize, for the past 25 years actually got their start all the way back at TSN, including legendary names like DJ Weeb. Additionally, Tribes found a home in the early LAN party scene where hundreds of players would lug their desktop PCs and giant CRT monitors across the country to compete. The most notable of these events was called UVA LAN, which was held for 8 consecutive years. LAN tournaments that could be considered proper esports events by today's standards were few and far between, but there were a few. Most notably, Tribes Gala, where 5150, the most legendary Tribes clan from across every iteration of the game, faced off against Team Imperial Elite for a 6-figure prize pool. Unfortunately, little video evidence of this event survived to this day. The Tribe series is set in a sprawling, Dune-esque universe within the broader Earthsiege and Starsiege lore. Despite being a multiplayer-only game, its deep lore only adds to the appeal and gives canonical meaning to each Tribe CTF match, which held cultural and ritualistic significance as a means of competition between the tribes, like the militaristic Blood Eagle, who seek to reclaim the Empire's glory, or the spiritually disciplined Diamond Sword, pursuing enlightenment through combat. In lieu of all-out war, they competed in blood sport. Despite Tribes 1's legendary status and cult following, it reportedly sold just under 100,000 copies, far below Sierra's target of 250,000. But these numbers hardly reflect the actual player base. Tribes 1 had no DRM protection, making it as easy to copy and share with friends as copying and pasting the game files onto their PC. And this was actually intentional. According to lead designer Scott Youngblood, the team wanted people to pirate the crap out of it, believing that the more people who played it, the better it was for the game's community and longevity. Tribes 1 became a hotbed for modders that would go on to give the game notable mods like Renegades, which introduced many new weapons, abilities, and deployables, a multiplayer Tribes RPG, and even Tribes Football mod, which is exactly what it sounds like, and was later credited as one of the main inspirations for Rocket League. As Tribes 1's player base waned, a new mod called LT, or Light Tribes, was born, which streamlined the game to 5 vs 5 and removed all base assets and armor types. Despite LT stripping out much of Tribes' signature complexity, it would go on to become the most played game mode over the past 2 decades. In fact, more than 25 years after release, you can still log on any given night for a game of Tribes 1 LT. Ultimately, despite its middling sales numbers, Tribes 1's influence and passionate fan base led Sierra to greenlight a sequel. Dynamics then canceled work on the single-player expansion titled Tribes Extreme and shifted their focus entirely to Tribes 2, which would go on to become arguably the most successful game in the franchise.
Cover our flag carrier force.
Our flag is secure! Tribes 2. Take up arms and fight with up to 64 other players online.
Released in March 2001, Tribes 2 built upon the foundation of its predecessor, with enhanced graphics, double the team sizes with up to 32 players per team, and a more diverse array of deployables, base assets, and vehicles. The game's vehicles were absolutely a standout feature. Tribes 2 introduced new vehicles like the Shrike, a mobile airfighter perfect for chasing down enemy flag carriers or setting up offensive flag routes. Other notable additions include the Bomber, which required 3 players to pilot, a gunner, and a bomber, to unleash destruction from above, and the Jericho, a slow-moving, armored vehicle that functioned as a mobile base for your team, providing inventory access, turret defense, and a sensor jammer. Out of all Tribes games, I think that Tribes 2 would have the most potential for success in today's market, because whether you were skilled or a complete novice, you could jump into a public server and just enjoy the chaos. Flying bombers with your friends, sneaking behind enemy lines with a stealth pack, to one-hit kill heavy armors with a shock lance, or blowing up the enemy generator room altogether with a satchel charge. The variety of tactics and tools made Tribes 2 a blast to play. It also leaned heavily into the competitiveness of Tribes players by giving players the ability to create and organize a clan directly within the game client, with built-in IRC chat rooms and forums, something few games have even attempted since. Tribes 2 received critical acclaim and more than doubled the sales of its predecessor in its first year, shipping over 200,000 copies. However, its release was marred by critical issues that would hamper its growth potential. First, the game required top-of-the-line PCs to run smoothly, making it inaccessible to players without cutting-edge equipment. I can still remember the feeling of despair when, after years of waiting, my Pentium 2 PC could not run Tribes 2 at all. Second, constant bugs, crashes, and server instability plagued the game. it was rare to play a single game without crashing in Tribes 2's early months. Third, while Tribes 2 incorporated skiing as an official mechanic this time around, it also introduced a speed cap on players, essentially a terminal velocity that you could never surpass. For Tribes 1 veterans like myself, this felt directly in conflict with Tribes' best attribute, speed, with its soupy and slower movement a huge turnoff to veterans. Nonetheless, sales had met Sierra's expectations, and this should have warranted Tribes 2's continued development with additional patches and content, or even an expansion likely. Unfortunately for Tribes fans, this would not be enough to save Dynamics from being shut down, due to no fault of their own. At the launch of Tribes 2, Dynamics' parent company Sierra was in crisis. A failed merger and a shaky macro environment due to the recent dot-com bust led to company-wide layoffs, and unfortunately, the tragic and untimely decision to cut Tribes 2 development short. The entire Dynamics team was laid off just 5 months after release. This left further development to a small in-house team at Sierra, which was a shell of the former development effort. Though Tribes 2 remained popular, a rocky launch and lack of support and updates inevitably limited its growth potential, hurting the franchise reputation and burning bridges within the community. First impressions matter, and Tribes 2's rocky launch pushed me, and many others, back to Tribes 1, where the LT community was still going strong. But after Dynamics closed, the community took over, reviving interest in Tribes 2 with community-made mods like the Classic and Base++ mods, which removed the speed cap and restored the fast-paced gameplay fans loved. These mods sparked a competitive resurgence with hundreds of teams of up to 16 versus 16 competing across various ladders on the Team Warfare League. It wasn't all doom and gloom. Tribes 2 would go on to have a thriving competitive and casual community, despite its rocky start.
He's got a lot of life here, has to get it up over the ridge line, gets it, almost killed to the stand, grab by Julius, lick my clit down, pick up by Original down, scramble is gonna get returned, kinesthetic returns one, Zero Skills gets the other, turn around Zero Skills, he got the cap chance, Flag is on the stand, does he get it? No, he's killed on the stand, I can't tell what's going on, pick up by Scythe, cap Scythe, no, Scythe is capped.
At the time, just about everyone assumed that console gaming would inevitably surpass PC gaming, so Sierra tasked Midway Studios Austin to produce a PlayStation 2 port of Tribes 2 dubbed Aerial Assault. While remembered fondly by those who played it, it made little impact on the gaming scene as a network connection was not yet built into consoles, severely limiting the potential of this online-only game. But of course, in typical Tribes fashion, there is even for this PS2 classic a small but dedicated community who still plays to this day. With Dynamics' closure and the future of the franchise in Sierra's hands, many worried that we would never see Tribes revived. But the Tribes IP was eventually handed off to a surprising new developer in Irrational Games, known for their work on the legendary single-player games System Shock and System Shock 2. This marked the beginning of work on the third mainline entry in the franchise, which would be the first to feature a single-player campaign, Tribes Vengeance.
We have ruled for 12 generations.
A crumbling empire, a murdered king, a vicious renegade, and one final chance.
Where are you going? To grow up.
For retribution.
Released in October 2004, Tribes Vengeance would be the first in the series to feature a narrative-driven single-player campaign, alongside a traditional multiplayer mode. The single-player was surprisingly fun, putting you in the shoes of a variety of characters on different sides of the conflict between the Blood Eagle, Imperials, and Children of the Phoenix, giving players a deeper look into the franchise's lore. From a multiplayer gameplay perspective, Vengeance took many bold liberties with the formula. First, maps were far smaller than Tribes 1 and 2, a major departure from the nearly infinite rolling hills from the previous entries. Instead of the out-of-bounds grid being simply a suggestion, there was a giant invisible wall keeping players in a confined area. This installment also introduced some of the most unique and novel weapons yet in Tribes, most notably the Grappler, a grappling hook for enhanced aerial mobility, allowing players to swing and maneuver like never before. and the buckler, a shield players could hold up to reflect incoming projectiles. New vehicles added strategic depth, including the Rover, a dune buggy that acted as a mobile spawn point that you could park behind the enemy base to initiate a surprise attack. The Fighter, a Dr. Robotnik-esque hovercraft that could fire a steady volley of rockets, and a Bomber, highly reminiscent of Tribes 2's. Instead of the original bunny hop style skiing though, where players bounced across the terrain, Vengeance used a frictionless boots system, which, in my opinion, severely limited players' ability to use the minute nooks and crannies of the terrain. In previous entries, a 90-degree crook in the terrain was an opportunity to redirect your momentum. In Vengeance, it was a surefire recipe to take harsh fall damage and lose all of your speed. This essentially meant that the grappling hook was the only way to get around and change your velocity mid-route. To boot, balance was not great at launch. While these new mechanics were undeniably fun and could be used creatively and to incredible effect, they were also overpowered, becoming dominant factors in competitive matches. In particular, a flag-capping meta evolved around choosing the tanky medium armor, a shield pack, and the buckler to become frustratingly unkillable. To many hardened veterans, it just wasn't worth making the jump to Vengeance, especially when Tribes 1 and 2 were still going relatively strong. Tribes was already a niche game, but Tribes Vengeance faced an uphill battle like none other. Sierra, Tribes' embattled publisher, had recently been sold off to Vivendi Universal Games, or VUG, just 2 months before the game's released. VUG became Vengeance's new de facto publisher, and their priorities were simply elsewhere, as they failed to market the game. To make matters worse, Vengeance released just 1 month apart from industry titans like Half-Life 2 and World of Warcraft. This led to Vengeance selling a paltry 47,000 copies. It was the worst performance yet in the series by a country mile. Due to the game's lackluster launch and tepid response from the Tribes community, VUG dropped support for the game entirely, leaving even its very first 1.1 patch unreleased. That's despite the fact that it was already finished and ready to ship. Just 5 months in, VUG abandoned Vengeance, an almost identical mirror to the painful fate of Tribes 2. But in true Tribes fashion, a small and dedicated community, of which I was part, stepped up to create custom mods and maps that improved Vengeance and helped sustain a small player base and competitive community. The game fostered a lively map-making ecosystem. I personally dabbled with map-making for the first and only time, remaking classics like Rain Dance and Stonehenge. But despite these efforts, Vengeance never recovered from its early setbacks and was a new low mark for the series. I enjoyed my time with Vengeance, but went back to Tribes 1 LT again within a year and never looked back. Tribes' future was once again called into question. With such a high-profile and spectacular failure, the IP would go dormant for 5 years. In 2009, the Tribes IP was acquired from VUG by a little-known company named Garage Games, a new game studio founded by former Dynamics developers who aimed to create advanced 3D gaming experiences within a web browser, all based on a modified version of Tribes 2's Torque engine. Garage Games announced that Starsiege Tribes would return as a browser-based game on their instant action platform, meant to promote an upcoming spiritual successor to Tribes called Fallen Empire, Legions. Legions brought bold new mechanics to the FPS Z formula, and arguably has the highest skill ceiling out of any game in the franchise, with even faster and twitchier movement. However, Instant Action and Legions struggled to gain any real traction, and Legions was cancelled after early beta testing. As you probably might expect by now, a small group of dedicated fans continued to build new maps and mods for Legions, keeping it on life support for a time. But the game had failed to make a major mark even within the FPS genre. With no new Tribes games in the works and the IP in limbo, it seemed the franchise would soon fade into obscurity. I had resigned myself to the idea that I might never see another Tribes game. Up until this point, I essentially was a Tribes-only multiplayer gamer, but I began to branch out into other competitive shooters like Quake Live and Enemy Territory Quake Wars. I would periodically go back and play Tribes 1 LT pickups, but had, for the most part, moved on. But then, out of the blue, a small studio named Hi-Rez acquired the Tribes IP, and announced that they were working on the next Tribes, their second game after their MMO global agenda began to wind down, and it would be the first entirely free-to-play mainline entry in the franchise, dubbed Tribes Ascend. Tribes Ascend launched in April 2012 as a free-to-play title. Free-to-play was relatively new and unproven for FPS games at the time. Furthermore, Ascend featured high-quality graphics and substantial content at launch, something most free-to-play shooters lacked. This low barrier to entry gave it incredible potential to reach an audience no Tribes had before. For the most part, Ascend retained the jetpack-fueled acrobatics, vehicles, a large array of weapons, and base assets that defined previous titles, while streamlining some of the core gameplay to appeal to a broader audience. For instance, players could now spawn with preset loadouts rather than needing to visit an inventory station to purchase their weapons and armor types, choosing from classes like the Pathfinder, a speed-focused flag-capturing role, and the Doombringer, a heavy defense class perfect for body-blocking cappers on the flag stand. Halo-esque health regeneration was also added, giving Tribes another familiar feature to modern shooters. At launch, Ascend received near unanimous critical acclaim and was largely touted as a worthy modernization of the classic Tribes experience. And it did well right from the get-go, reportedly reaching as many as 1.2 million players, many of whom were experiencing their very first Midair disc kill, or Blue Plate Special, as it was dubbed in Ascend, and getting hooked by the oh-so-satisfying cha-ching! For veterans like myself, it was thrilling to see a Tribes game reaching new heights, and I dove in headfirst to stream as much as I could on Twitch and commentate Ascend's many community cups and tournaments. But despite the fact that the game was by all accounts succeeding, and most players were having a great time, its gameplay still couldn't quite recapture the magic of earlier titles for much of the hardened Tribes community. For starters, although the game boasted larger maps than Vengeance, they paled in comparison to the expansiveness that defined Tribes 1 and 2. In particular, launch maps like Crossfire were tiny and mostly flat. My biggest gripe with the game was its physics. When played in a competitive setting, the only way to run a properly fast cap route was to use your thrust pack and disc jump twice to propel yourself early enough in your route that you had enough time for health regen to kick in by the time you got to the enemy flag stand. However, if you were to be so much as tickled by a stray chain gun bullet, the regen process would stop, effectively killing your route. The game also featured an absolutely overpowered hit-scan rifle, something no Tribes had had previously. To make matters worse, most maps in Ascend had little to no line of sight blockers, meaning that a skilled sniper could see and easily nail shots from across the entire map. This heavily skewed the meta towards a very defensive slog, making for a grueling pace. Still, I had a blast with Ascend. It was the most players any Tribes had had, ever, and the hype was real. Moments like the infamous 4chan versus Reddit grudge match took the internet by storm. Gaming was blowing up on Twitch and YouTube, and creators like Total Biscuit, may he rest in peace, were gushing about Tribes to an audience of hundreds of thousands. Tribes Ascend also gave us what I believe to be the most watched Tribes esports match of all time. Held just before the NASL StarCraft 2 finals, a few thousand fans packed into an auditorium outside of Toronto to watch Tribes Ascend, with tens of thousands more watching online.
Oh, so important. Here we go. GMC's got a full health pickup at 266 kilometers an hour. Gonna like to disc jump there, sacrificing a lot of health for that height. Look how high up he is in the air. Where is that sniper? I believe they have him disrupted. Yes, Remix has gone down. Bojingo Bells and Z Protoss are in position to disrupt this stand. He's gonna come in from very, very high up. Come on, here he comes laying it down. Fire getting in there, gonna get that E-grab. Gonna keep it moving, gonna keep that thing from dying. Here we go, projectiles there to help defend. Fire gonna keep it moving around the back, and unfortunately gonna run into that rock.
This
and this
would be
one
the
looks like
winning
it's gonna
cap.
go to Legion. He's gonna pass it up, gonna be caught, and there it is. We're going to game 5.
There we go, man. It's coming down to it.
Despite the fact that 90% of these viewers were there in anticipation of StarCraft, it was still an awesome moment for Tribes. I had the immense pleasure of commentating this event on stage with Hi-Rez Bart, and can still remember the audible oohs, ahs, and gasps during the nail-biting best of 5 that went all the way to the end, packed with epic moments and storylines. Generally, those that played Ascend in its first 6 months had a great time with it. But that positive vibe, unfortunately, did not last. If you've seen anything about Hi-Rez online, whether from long-winded Reddit posts or YouTube essayists, you're likely familiar with the overwhelmingly negative reputation they have in the gaming community. This reputation comes from a long history of launching promising titles, then making mind-numbing decisions, causing community outcry, and subsequently dropping support at the first sign of trouble. This trend started with their first game, Global Agenda, and despite a strong launch, Ascend would be the next in this unfortunate list. Ascend was dubbed in early marketing as the world's fastest shooter, but in a misguided attempt to make Ascend more accessible for newcomers, Hi-Rez introduced speed caps once again, mostly to slow down pub-stomping Tribes veterans. This change was met with intense criticism, but the game's monetization model would prove its most controversial misstep. New weapons were available through in-game purchase, with many items like the Jackal notably overpowered on release, requiring players either to grind extensively, and we're talking dozens of hours for a single weapon, or pay up. This spawned the perception that although the game was free to play, it was also pay to win. Another contentious moment came with the reworking of a fan-favorite map called Bella Omega. When players voiced complaints about the new version, Hi-Rez responded by pulling the map from rotation entirely, seemingly a punitive move that was later confirmed as such. While moments like this may seem relatively small, they were part of a larger trend of Hi-Rez's adversarial tone with the community. Ultimately, Tribes Ascend struggled to maintain its early traction. As the game was waning, Hi-Rez launched a major patch in February 2013 to try and reinvigorate the stunted community. When that didn't happen, the game's updates slowed to a crawl. Just a couple of months later, in July 2013, Hi-Rez announced that they were dropping support for the game altogether, with Hi-Rez shifting resources to their new title, a third-person MOBA called Smite. Smite immediately took off to become Hi-Rez's only true mainstream success, but this spelled doom for Ascend. Unlike the old ways of buying a $50 boxed game that you bought once, owned forever, and had no expectations of continuous content updates, the free-to-play model is entirely predicated on consistent releases. When those releases dry up, you can expect that the game will wither on the vine and soon disappear. Furthermore, Tribes' vibrant modding and mapping communities could not step in to be the saviors this time, with no such tools available. Ascend eventually became overrun with cheaters and speed hackers, and for Hi-Rez, the easiest solution seemed to be simply to shut off the official servers. At this point, the community was forced to take over again, hosting their own servers in order to keep the game alive. The franchise once again went dormant, and it would be more than a decade until Tribes 3 was announced, the longest break between mainline entries. But there would soon be a new glimmer of hope, this time emerging from the community itself. In the midst of this epic drought, a new community-driven project called Midair was in the works, showing early versions to a small group of excited Tribes fans at PAX West 2016 and 2017. The next year, Midair announced a Kickstarter and quickly raised $128,416 to get development off the ground, billed as a direct spiritual successor to Tribes. Midair launched to the world in May 2018, and mostly captured the beloved physics and movement mechanics of Tribes 1, while simultaneously making it more accessible to newcomers. In my opinion, it stands today as the best modern adaptation of Tribes' movement and physics. However, Midair faced significant challenges from the very beginning. The game was a passion project by a small team of relatively inexperienced developers who lacked resources and institutional knowledge. Still, they ambitiously aimed to replicate the entire Tribes experience, complete with bases, vehicles, expansive maps, and much more. As a result, Midair launched in a state more closely resembling an early pre-alpha than full release, with incomplete animation, textures, sound, and barely functioning vehicles. On launch day, it peaked at under 1,000 concurrent players on Steam, and only quickly dropped from there. Sadly, its developer Archetype Studios wound down just a few months after launch and ceased development due to financial constraints. As with all Tribes games, Midair did retain a dedicated player base who felt that its physics were just too good to be left for dead, and the codebase was eventually handed off to a small group of developers who streamlined Midair into a more manageable 5v5 mode that mirrored Tribes 1 LT, improving its core mechanics, adding new maps, polishing the look and feel, and ultimately relaunched it on Steam as Midair Community Edition in May 2020, later renamed Midair 2. Ultimately, Midair, without the name recognition or backing of Tribes, could not hold a candle to a mainline Tribes game in terms of player base and overall interest. But to me, Midair 2 still embodies the essence of Tribes gameplay and is an absolute joy to play, with a dedicated community making it one of the most active FPS games today. At this point, I had little belief that we would ever see the Tribes IP revived. But then, in November 2023, I received a fateful Discord DM from a close Tribes friend that stopped me in my tracks. He confirmed that Prophecy Games, a Hi-Rez subsidiary led by the former Hi-Rez CEO, Erez Gorin, was working on a new Tribes game. And this was not just any Tribes game, this one was to be titled Tribes 3 Rivals. Not Tribes Rivals, not Tribes Ascend 2, but a full-numbered sequel, the first in over 20 years. Prophecy Games had recently experimented with several Tribes-related spin-offs, including Starsiege Raiders and Starsiege Dead Zone. Both were quickly abandoned after failing to gain traction. Prophecy seemingly was following a startup-like strategy of rapidly launching products to validate market interest before investing further. While this is common in the startup world, this approach left their players frustrated, often stuck with a half-baked game, abruptly pulled from Steam, even after purchasing expensive starter packs. But despite my apprehension, I was excited to jump into the first Tribes 3 playtest. The initial sessions were incredibly rough. After all, Prophecy had been working on Dead Zone just 1 month prior, only shifting focus full-time to Tribes 3 weeks before these playtests took place. But week by week, new builds arrived, and the game was improving dramatically. Prophecy's team of 40 developers made impressive strides, fixing issues and adding fresh content at a more than respectable pace. Even more exciting, they were actively listening to community members and feedback from veteran Tribes players. Then, my excitement turned to dread. Just a few weeks later, after the initial playtests, and while the game was far from ready from the public limelight, Prophecy released a gameplay trailer on IGN and announced that playtests would start shortly. The gameplay on display was unrefined, nowhere near ready for public viewing. It had no build-up or any real social marketing campaign around it. And within just a few short weeks, open playtests unceremoniously began, with no marketing or fanfare. Despite the rushed launch, this was still an incredibly exciting moment for Tribes fans. Clearly, calling it Tribes 3 was enough on its own to drive substantial interest. Public playtests began on weekends, and the community of Tribes veterans started to come back together in a way that I don't think even Ascend had at launch. As more and more Tribes fans, new and old, poured into the Discord, the anticipation for each weekend playtest was palpable and invigorating. This gave me the chance to reconnect with quite literally hundreds of familiar faces and names, from old clanmates to rivals to pub stompers, from across my 25 years with the game, some of whom I hadn't talked to for decades. I started streaming and creating content on YouTube, which, to my surprise, was reaching tens of thousands of viewers. This was the most fun I'd had gaming in many, many years. From a physics perspective, I still maintain that Tribes 3 had a much stronger start than Ascend. It was faster, much faster. Running routes still required skill and creativity, but the balance felt fair, making speed accessible without feeling trivial. Tribes 3 also did away with fall damage, which was a controversial move at first, but one that made movement easier for newer players, without taking too much away. Tribes 3 also introduced novel mechanics like the Blink Pack, which allowed players to teleport short distances similar to Tracer's Blink, while still maintaining their momentum. While this pack could be a nightmare for flag defenders, it allowed for incredible skill expression and creativity for flag runners. It was exhilarating to see players innovate new gameplay concepts in real time. While Tribes 3 effectively reinvigorated the Tribes community, it still suffered from a series of design decisions that clearly were aimed to make the game more accessible for new players at the expense of freedom of movement and skill expression. The initial maps in the open playtests were tiny by Tribe standards, even smaller than Ascend's, feeling cramped and arena-like rather than expansive and open, with team size initially capped at 7 versus 7. The goal here seemed apparent: keep the action confined to a more condensed arena to make it more action-packed. But I think this was a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes Tribes so epic: the sweeping vistas and giant battles across alien planets. There were also no vehicles in Tribes 3, and never would be. For fans who felt Tribes 2's sprawling maps, large team sizes, and complex base gameplay were the pinnacle of the series, this would be a tough pill to swallow. Though Prophecy eventually added larger maps and increased the player cap to 12 versus 12, these early limitations left a strong negative impression. The amount of jetpack fuel each player had before needing to regenerate was also by far the lowest in the series. Though it regenerated quickly once you landed on the ground, players could only stay in the air for a limited amount of time. Also, air control, especially when moving at high velocities, was as low as the series had ever seen. I later learned that these design decisions were driven directly by Prophecy's CEO Erez Gorin, who thought that bringing players closer to the ground would make it more friendly for players like him. In the end, it only reduced the feeling of freedom that had defined Tribes gameplay. Nonetheless, excitement around Tribes 3 during these first few months of playtests was undeniable. Thousands were playing Tribes again for the first time in a decade. The organized pickup community was thriving, with high-level matches running 24/7, and a massive draft tournament brought together veterans from every era, with over 30 12v12 teams composed of players of all skill levels, ages, and Tribes backgrounds. Top players were grinding 10+ hours a day to climb the community pickup leaderboards in anticipation of the first major tournaments. New maps, weapons, and abilities were dropping weekly. It was an undeniably awesome time to be a Tribes fan. For now. Unfortunately, it wasn't long until the familiar high-res pattern of questionable game decisions and a combative relationship with the community would emerge. In a fateful patch, Erez once again stepped in to make an executive decision. The speed of the disc launcher's projectile was to be massively increased in order to make hitting long-range midair shots more accessible and more common. Unfortunately, this move instead trivialized one of the most satisfying aspects of Tribes, and made dueling one-dimensional. Whoever fired first almost always won. The community outcry for this one was intense, but Prophecy refused to back down. Perhaps not as impactful to the gameplay, but in a similar vein, Prophecy also introduced a one-button flag passing mechanic which removed the need for skill and coordination to move the flag between teammates. While not game-breaking, this exemplified this trend of dumbing down Tribes for accessibility's sake, and was a change that absolutely no one asked for. Later, Prophecy introduced a new game mode called Honor Ball, a single-ball, team-based game akin to Rocket League meets Tribes, where teams would fight in the middle of the map for a ball and dunk it into their opponent's goal. Initially, it was seen as a fun side mode, and the community was jazzed to run some tournaments for it. But Erez had convinced himself that this new game mode was actually the future of Tribes, and strongly insinuated that it would become a new primary focus for the team. This sparked serious concern from players with decades of CTF experience, not to mention an incredibly active and passionate competitive CTF community playing Tribes 3 right then and there. Most, if not all, of these directives were driven by Erez himself. His decisions were final, no matter the outcry from the community or even his internal employees. And his control expanded to all aspects of the business, from marketing to monetization and community. On March 12th, with less than 6 months of total development time going into Tribes 3, the game launched into early access. And it wasn't as a free-to-play game like Ascend. This time it was a $20 price tag with optional cosmetics and skins for sale. While this appealed to players tired of the Battle Pass grind and is admittedly very cheap, it also meant an uphill battle in a competitive market dominated by AAA free-to-play shooters like Apex, Overwatch, and Valorant. Such a launch would require a robust marketing campaign and consistent support for the game to gain traction. Prophecy delivered neither. There was virtually no marketing for this crucial launch. No influencers of note, no viral marketing strategy, no social media advertisements, no esports tournaments or community events, just a janky CGI trailer. This was absolutely mind-boggling for me, especially considering Erez had mentioned in Discord that the game had a $500,000 per month burn rate with over 40 full-time developers. Why spend millions to make a game, yet put no real effort into the marketing of it? It just made no sense. To make matters worse, on Tribes 3's launch, Erez spent the whole day in the main Tribes 3 Discord actively attacking some of the game's most loyal fans for giving legitimate criticism, even going so far as to ban users simply for sharing their feedback on the game. When passionate players offered suggestions for improvements, they were met with accusations like, "Why do you want to kill Tribes?" This may sound minor, but perceptions do matter, and Prophecy already needed to rebuild goodwill after the missteps of Ascend. Instead, Erez's approach should be studied as an example of how not to manage a community, shifting the conversation from the game itself to Prophecy's hostile approach to the community. This bled into Steam reviews, Reddit posts, YouTube comments, and beyond. It became the conversation around launch. I was furious, not just because of what this meant for the legacy of Tribes, and not just because of all of the hundreds of hours I had put into trying to help grow the game, but because there were plenty of talented, well-intentioned developers at Prophecy who were being steamrolled by the man on top. With no tutorial or onboarding to speak of, Prophecy instead opted to implement bot matches for new players, a common tactic in games like Fortnite that gives players a shot of dopamine from dunking on terrible bots. However, there were far too many matches to get through, and these matches were poorly executed. Bots never even attempted to capture your flag, leaving players who chose defensive roles with no action at all, and creating matches where neither team scored.
You heard you've played 5. Yeah, every match has been a 5-0. I don't know why we have never lost. I'm not even doing anything, I'm just floating around.
My best guess, based on Steam data that's available, is that between only 30,000 to 40,000 people bought the game, even given its relatively cheap price tag. This launch was an absolute disaster, with Tribes 3 failing to cross the 1,000 player mark on launch day. Alongside early access, Prophecy released a roadmap which included 6 planned patches with new maps and weapons to look forward to. But to the surprise of no one, Erez abandoned Tribes 3 to start work on his next game, Ultra Strikers, a spin-off based on the Honor Ball game mode, leaving only one full-time employee working on Tribes 3. 9 months after early access, just 3 of 6 planned patches have been released, with no new updates on the horizon. To add insult to injury, on June 26th, Prophecy posted a blog post titled "Giving Back to the Tribes 3 and Starsiege Dead Zone Players," where they promised free credits in Ultra Strikers to those who had purchased their earlier games, giving little solace to those now mourning the death of yet another Tribes game. Tribes 3's player base hasn't fully dropped off, with both competitive pickups and casual pubs running daily, but the writing appears to be on the wall. The game is now peaking at less than 100 players per day, and just about no one expects that we'll get another patch. Oh, and Ultra Strikers? It's already been abandoned too. So where does that leave Tribes and the FPS-Z community today? Can Tribes ever be successful again? It's true that no Tribes game has ever been a mainstream hit, so the business case for a new entry is definitely shaky. But I don't buy the argument that this genre is simply too hard. The setbacks for most Tribes games had far more to do with corporate mismanagement than the game itself. There are a couple of Tribes-related projects in the works, even some with original Tribes developers like Codename Broadside and the whimsically named Shazballs. While I haven't seen anything yet that inspires much hope, I'll be watching these closely. Even if Tribes as a franchise itself never has a resurgence, you can still experience its impact in the games you play today. Whether it's Halo CTF on wide open maps mixing player and vehicle combat, Pharah in Overwatch raining down rockets from above, sliding downhill in Apex Legends, or the nuanced car physics in Rocket League, each game can thank Tribes for walking so that they could run. Still, I'll never give up hope entirely. Maybe one day, a developer with the right vision and resources will step forward, bringing Tribes back to life, or at least creating an FPS-Z that truly honors its legacy. But even if that day never comes, I can assure you one thing: Tribes will never die. A small but devoted community will always keep its spirit alive, and its mark on the gaming industry, and on the lives of those who played it, will never be forgotten. Despite Tribes 3's recent high-profile failure, it did spark somewhat of a resurgence of interest in the classic Tribes titles, with renewed activity across every mainline entry in the franchise. The advent of Discord as well has been a godsend, making it easier than ever to organize games and reconnect in each game's respective server. Here's a breakdown of the most active Tribes games today, and what to expect if you want to join in. If you're looking for the most consistently active Tribes game, Tribes 3 might still be your best bet. Tribes 3 probably has the most active pub scene, with public games running daily. Organized pickups and mixers often take place in the evenings and on weekends, and the game recently saw a draft tournament with over a dozen 9v9 teams participating. Tribes 3 may continue to have some longevity yet, as it has strong community leaders who are continuing to host events and bring new players into the fold. Tribes 1 also maintains a lively community with both public and organized pickup LT games happening essentially every night for the past 25 years. There are sporadic efforts to organize T1 base games on the weekends, but LT is mostly where the action lies. I did hear a little rumor that some developers are actually working on rewriting Tribes 1's netcode, so I'm going to be watching that one super closely. With Tribes 2, the presence of bots ensures that you can always jump in and enjoy a session, even with a small player count. However, on weekends, the Tribes 2 community always comes together for organized base CTF games, with team sizes reaching up to 20v20 and even larger. It's a chaotic, nostalgic, good time. If you want a taste of Tribes as it was originally intended to be played, this might be your best bet. Much to my surprise, even Tribes 2 console spin-off Aerial Assault has players on a regular basis. While Tribes Vengeance was not widely played on launch, I'm pleased to say that the community does get together at least once a week for game nights, usually on Thursdays and often spilling over into the weekends. They're playing a heavily modified version of the original game that accentuates Vengeance's wacky mechanics, which makes it a goofy, good time. Admittedly, I haven't followed the Tribes Ascent scene closely, but it is still played mostly in the form of organized pickups and mixers on the weekends, although it does appear to be somewhat less active than other entries in the franchise. Midair 2 is my current FPS Z game of choice. While it's a stripped-down 5v5 LT experience without base assets or class types, Midair 2 nails the core feel of Tribes with a more modern look and feel. It's also one of the most active FPS games out there, especially if you're looking for organized competition with daily pickup games and regular tournaments, including the largest event yet, which is running right now and features 19 teams. Unfortunately, Midair 2 rarely has active public servers, and joining the pickup community can be daunting, but I highly encourage you to check it out. I'll leave links in the video description for how to download and play each Tribes game. Safe to say, joining the Discord is the first place you should start. Well, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into my favorite game franchise of all time. Tribes had a massive impact on my life, and set me on my life path to eventually find my way into the gaming and esports industries. If you did enjoy the video, please do give it a thumbs up, share it with a friend, and comment below with your favorite Tribes memories. Whew, that was quite a video. I've never done anything like this before, never edited a YouTube video of this kind and scripted it and all of that good stuff, and man, it was a lot of work, but it's a labor of love. I truly love Tribes, and it really is a special game to me, especially Tribes 1. If you enjoyed this video, if Tribes means as much to you as it does to me, please do give it a comment below. Please let me know some of your favorite Tribes memories, maybe something you learned from the video. Give it a thumbs up, share with a friend, and check out Tribes. I mean, there's still activity. Yeah, not a lot of people are playing Tribes, but every single Tribes game still has activity on a weekly basis. So if any of this seemed compelling to you, interesting, if you're a former Tribes player, or you're your current Tribes player and you just want to jump back in there, make sure to just do it. Tribes is great, and I will continue to play, I will continue to stream, I will continue to follow the scene, and hopefully one day we can play Tribes again together. All right, peace.